So the questions are these. How can we really activate the best of the private sector to meet the challenges of the real world? Is there a way to accelerate my career that doesn't involve boring online or classroom courses? And can I really impact people in the developing world with the skills that I have? Can I finally feel proud of what I know? Those are the questions, and this podcast will give you the answers. My name is Philippa White, and this is TIE Unearthed. Keep listening, and you can follow us on our journey as we show you how we're connecting the private sector with the social sector to make change. Hello everyone, Philippa White here, and welcome to episode 21 of TIE's podcast. Now today I'm speaking with my friend Claudio Fernandes. He's an economist and policy advisor based in Brazil, but is actually currently in San Francisco. Now, Claudio, it's really great to have you with us today. Hello.
Hello, Philippa. Yes, definitely fantastic.
Now, I would love our listeners to better understand you and your background as it sort of puts all of this in perspective. So I've known Claudio since I moved to Brazil in 2005, and actually he was involved with our first ever TIE project with Gestos, Chris Jackson, and Leo Burnett all the way back in 2007. So yeah, we go way back. Now, Claudio is an economist who has been working in the sustainable development field since 2008. He has participated in a number of UN negotiations, has been part of working groups to develop strategies for the G20, and is the co-founder and member of the Brazilian Working Group for the 2030 Agenda implementation. Now, this is the 2030 agenda that all countries should be working towards to meet the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Now, Claudio co-edited and was the creative director of the Spotlight Report for Sustainable Development in Brazil. Now, this is what we're going to be talking a lot about today. It really is a fantastic read. If you want to understand the reality on the ground in Brazil today, right now, this tells you that. So you can find it on the link on the bottom of this blurb of this podcast. But yeah, we're going to be bringing that to life today. So Claudio is back in San Francisco for now for a short time, where he lived for 10 years as a pioneer graphic, motion, and interactive designer, just as the internet was being invented, which would have been an incredible time to be there. But he's there currently in preparations for an important UN meeting on financing for development and for the IMF World Bank spring meetings. They're both happening in April of this year. So, Claudio, I would first of all, love for you to talk to us about your work, about Gestos. Can you bring that to life for us?
Sure. Gestos is a non-governmental organization based in Recife, Pernambuco, Brazil, that was founded in 1993 to try and respond to the AIDS epidemic. And throughout the 90s, Gestos worked a lot from the grassroots perspective to try and help people that were in dire conditions being infected. And at that time, there was no treatment for HIV. So it was a very complicated situation. By the end of the 90s, Gestos has realized that the driving force behind the HIV epidemic in developing countries was very much a political and economic structural issue. So many things needed to change to be able to save people's lives. From then on, Gestos started participating in the world arena or the world stage. And when Alessandra Nilo, co-founder and the current executive director and coordinator of Gestos, participated at the UN General Assembly special session on AIDS in 2001. From that point on, Gestos became part of a global civil society movement to try and solve some of the world pressing problems. I came on board in 2008. I'm an economist, as you said. But for the longest time, I was working a lot on graphic design and filmmaking, particularly here in San Francisco, when the World Wide Web was being born and being developed. In that process, also, I co-founded a company called Zoom Media, and that company in 2005 was acquired by another company. And Zoom Media was specialized in two areas, mainly. The clients came from two areas. One was the biotechnology and pharmaceutical sector, and the other one was the venture capital sector. So it was a tie-in between biotechnology and science development and the financing arm of that process for innovation. Since 2008, I started working more closely with Gestos in the economic development perspective to try and solve some of the world's pressing issues. Since HIV and AIDS, was such an emergency at that moment, but after, for instance, treatment became available, then one of the main issues became access to treatment. In a developed world, access to treatment was somewhat guaranteed by the whole process of public health systems and even private health systems. But in developing countries, even those countries that do have a public health system, they were not willing to spend the necessary resources to acquire the treatment for a population that was identified as somewhat of a marginalized population. So became part of the advocacy of all of the AIDS organizations of the world to put pressure both on the UN, also on the Global Fund. Global Fund being the main financing source for responding to HIV and AIDS, that was created on the unfolding processes of the UNGAS, which is the UN General Assembly Special Session that happened in 2001. So the next step was to create the Global Fund to treat malaria, tuberculosis, and AIDS. There are other initiatives to fund AIDS, but that's the main initiative that funds the access to treatment for people living with HIV in developing countries. In that process, then other issues start piling up. Then it's not only a question of access to medicine, but then it becomes a question of human rights. It becomes a question of eliminating prejudices. It becomes a question of gender equality. So we realized then that the issue was a cross-cutting issue among many other issues in that process. And nowadays, since 2015, for instance, when the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was negotiated and approved by the United Nations, approved actually not by the United Nations, approved by 192 countries. This is a consensus document approved by 192 countries that pledged to change the paradigm of development in their economies based on the Sustainable Development Goals that are anchored in three pillars: environment, social, and economics. One thing cannot bypass the other, because every time that economics, for instance, gets the prevalence over social and environment, then we have major disturbances and asymmetries in the environment and social that ends up affecting also the results of economics. So these three pillars need to be tackled in unison, and that's what the Sustainable Development Goals are about, and the 2030 Agenda as well.
And so just moving back before we move forward to talk about these goals and the importance of them and all of these countries working towards them, just give us an idea of the actual situation currently right now in Brazil. So, for example, I'm aware that you're preparing for these meetings that are happening next month. If I'm not mistaken, you had a meeting earlier today. Just can you bring that to life? Because Brazil is currently facing, and we will talk about Brazil in more detail in a second, but Brazil is currently facing one of the most challenging moments of its history because of COVID. And I'd just love to understand, in your view, a bit of a synopsis of the conversation that you had earlier today and what we're facing right now.
Indeed. I think since colonization, Brazil has never faced a traumatic and complex crisis as this one because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the preparation I'm making for these meetings is since I'm part of the economic and financing arm of the monitoring process of the implementation of the agenda in the countries. It's pretty much on trying to find solutions, financial solutions, to stop the bleeding, let's put it this way. Because even a country like Brazil, which is a middle-income country that had been upgraded in the first decade of this century, upgraded as a middle-income country to a middle-high-income country. But even though Brazil was upgraded by the World Bank to be a middle-high-income country, Brazil is an extremely unequal country. And that inequality has come to the surface in starking images that is happening right now because of the crisis. So this morning, actually very early in the morning, because it was New York time and I'm on Pacific Standard Time, there was a meeting convened by the Secretary General with the Global Civil Society group that follows and monitors financing for sustainable development, which is our part. And the Undersecretary of the United Nations, Ms. Amina Mohamed, and several ambassadors and permanent representatives of the countries were part in this meeting, particularly the ambassador from Canada, Mr. Bob Ray, and Mr. Courtney Rattray, ambassador from Jamaica, because Canada, Jamaica, and the Secretary General put together a process to try and find solutions, financial solutions, for the situation under the COVID-19 pandemic. So, for instance, there are about 54 countries right now in debt distress, almost default in their debt, in their public debt and their external debt. And not only the situation is extremely complicated, but also add on to the fact that these countries still need to buy the vaccines to vaccinate their population. And so they are already in debt distress and they are being forced to borrow more to be able to buy the vaccines. And so it's a very complicated matter at this moment. So it's a very complicated situation because some of the countries, for instance, they are trying to help the least developed countries that are in this very dire situation, both in the health sector and in the financial end of it. At the same time, these developed countries are opposing a proposal from the World Trade Organization to waive the intellectual property rights on the vaccines. So there will be more production of vaccines in every country. There will be technology transfer in every country, and then people would be able to access the vaccines. But the developed countries where the main pharmaceutical companies that have developed the vaccine so far oppose this World Trade Organization TRIPS waiver. When I say TRIPS, it's the Treaty on the Rights of Intellectual Property. So there was a negotiation that had occurred during the first decade of this century. And that's what governs the intellectual property laws and procedures in the world.
Yeah. As far as the situation in Brazil, because we're all aware that there's so many different forces at play here with regards to the lack of vaccines. It's not because of money. Brazil has money to buy them. It's lack of leadership. There's a lot of poverty in Brazil, and as a result of the fact that there's more informal workers, locking down has a huge impact on the population and the economy. But at the same time, if we don't lock down, we, a country of 200 million people where there's people congregating all the time in the streets, we're now seeing the rise of numbers of COVID to a level where the hospital system is now shutting down. And, and we're creating a super virus. I'm just keen to know, is this known? Is this something that is being talked about on an international UN level? Can you just bring this to life for the listeners?
Interesting that you said that, because today, even though the meeting with the General Secretariat was about debt, liquidity, and finance, I had an opportunity to speak And when I took the floor, I called attention to that fact because I heard it from the neuroscientist, a Brazilian neuroscientist called Miguel Nicolelis, that the situation in Brazil is definitely pointing towards a high probability of a complete mutation of the virus. Not only a different cepa of the same virus, like a SARS-CoV-2, as the P1, for instance, that came out of South Africa, or the P2 that came out of Brazil, or the other variant that also exists at the UK at this moment. No, he was talking about a complete different virus, something that he called, quote unquote, a SARS-CoV-3. And that would make the vaccines that were created for the SARS-CoV-2 completely irrelevant for that. So the risk is very high. I called attention of the UN Secretariat on that, and I even suggested, from my capacity as a civil society organization, for the Secretary General to convene a special meeting of the Security Council to discuss the matter. Why? Because in Brazil, as you said, and you are completely right, Brazil is not a poor country. Brazil is a country with a lot of poverty. It's a country with a lot of wealth because it's a big country. I say that Brazil has a very big economy because it's a big country, but it's not that great of an economy because the economy is very much primary products for export and a lot of informality in the labor market. Informality in the labor market means exactly what you said. People need to go out and make a living. And not only that, when they are locked in their homes, they do not have access to Social Security, because if you live based on informality, you don't contribute to Social Security, so you have no savings. So the situation is quite complex. But the dispute between economics and health is not a real issue for Brazil. Why? Because first of all, you have to take care of the health emergency. And here I would like to highlight that this is not a simple type of health emergency. Just imagine if the HIV virus had the same facility to spread among people. So the HIV virus can be contained because if you wear condom and if you practice safe sex, then you can contain the HIV virus. But people cannot stop breathing. And even with masks, it's not enough to contain the SARS-CoV-2 that created the COVID-19 pandemic. But just as you said, in Brazil, there is enough resources. Brazil is not a country in debt distress, despite what the government tends to say, and the press in Brazil tends to comply with this lie, because it's a lie. It's not true that Brazil is in debt distress. Much the opposite. If you compare Brazil with a country that is our neighbor, Argentina, Argentina is in debt distress. Argentina defaulted on its payment. Argentina borrowed 57 billion from the IMF, and Argentina issued a 100-year bond that was bought in 2 years ago. It was bought in less than 24 hours by a lot of investment banks. So Argentina is in debt distress. Brazil is not. The other thing is Brazil has a very well-equipped public health system. And Brazil has, for the longest time, a very good experience on vaccination. The vaccination campaigns in Brazil against polio, against measles, for instance, against several other vaccination processes have been extremely successful because the logistics of the public health system in Brazil called SUS, S-U-S, or the Unified Health System, was all in place. But there is a lack of leadership in every part of the current federal government and in most state governments.
So this actually brings me nicely to the Spotlight report that you and your team created to capture the situation in Brazil with regards to the country's ability to reach the 2030 agenda, which we talked about earlier with regards to the Brazilian Sustainable Development Goals. Now, just for our listeners, this report is extraordinary. It's full of so much current data that, if I'm not mistaken, that's not coming out of any other organization. It is the only document of its kind. Am I right?
In Brazil, yes, it's the only document of this kind. And actually, so in the world, is one of the few documents of its kind in the whole world.
Wow. I mean, it's extraordinary. And they break down the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and explaining exactly where Brazil is at in each goal. Now, if you read this, which I highly recommend you do if you want to understand the actual reality of Brazil on the ground, because the government back in sort of, as you touched on it as well, back in sort of 2012, 2011, Brazil did a wonderful job of selling Brazil. The exchange rate showed this trust that investors had in the country. But I kept thinking, this doesn't make sense because there's no investment in the actual infrastructure of this country. When you look at education, when you look at the health system, when you look at the situation of the water system. And I just kept thinking, how is it that Brazil is able to compete with Canada and the UK and, European countries? And we are now seeing that actually this isn't the case. And this document really brings this to life. It's incredibly dense. It's extremely useful. There's a lot of data there. For example, one thing that really struck me was the examples of the 26 billion liters of sewage that was pumped into nature, so rivers and oceans, every single day in 2018 when the last data came out. And there's no improvement. So that's 43% of all sewage. And this led to 233,000 hospitalizations related to waterborne diseases in just children of that year. And with no investment in this area, I can't believe that it's got any better. Is there any other, there was just so many interesting points in that document that I thought, oh my God. And I just wonder, just from your point of view, having pulled this together, and obviously we could talk about this for, we could do a course at university on this, but I'm just wondering, in these areas that we're talking about that really are points that people are interested in, I just wonder, is there any data that stands out to you that you can bring to life for us?
Definitely. That's what this document is all about. It's all about data. It's all about evidence-based, concrete data. It's not a speech, it's not a narrative. It just shows by crossing all of this data. And by the way, most of this data were produced by official institutions, meaning the Brazilian Statistics and Geography institutions, meaning the Transparency Portal of the federal government, meaning the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Commerce, Trade and Services, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So they're all, most of them, official data. The only parts where we don't use official data is when the data is not available. Okay? So just to bring some other things, for instance, you are talking about water and sanitation. So for every 100 liters, sorry for the UK and US crowd, but for every 100 liters of water that is transported in Brazil to get into somebody's tap or a shower, 38 liters gets wasted just because of holes and problems in the transmission pipes. So that's basic infrastructure that we're talking about. Brick and mortar basic infrastructure. But when we talk about, for instance, education, when we talk, for instance, about health, which are also infrastructure, but it's for human capital, for human development, then the situation is very complex when we analyze, for instance, the amount of resources that the government spend on those very important infrastructure conditions for people. Because countries tend to invest in other countries and companies tend to invest in other countries, and when they have a good pool of people that know how to do things, good pool of labor, good pool of investment, facilities and rule of law, and an environment where the business can be performed in a secure, safe way, So there are no extra risks to somebody investing their resources in another country without having certain guarantees. But in education, for instance, since 2016, the federal budget, which is the main budget for education in the country, has been stagnated, because in Brazil they approved this ceiling for basic investment in education, health, and social assistance and social security. So health, education, and social assistance for a country filled with people that are poor, that need public schools, public hospitals, and public resources to fend for their lives, it's a recipe for disaster. So we have
and what stood out for me just listening to this, and you'll know the percentages perhaps not off the top of your head, but the last year or 2 years ago, and the money, there was a huge amount of investment that was in health, was in innovation, was in science. It went to the military. So I'm thinking a lot of the budget from education probably also went there. I don't want to make any assumptions, but I'm guessing that's probably the case.
Yes, but also goes to the financial markets, because it's a financial determinant of that. Because in Brazil, the government thinks that the country cannot renegotiate their bonds with their creditors, and then they just try to raise the interest rates to attract financial capital through the interest rates being higher than the interest rates that all of the developed countries in the world are paying right now. So just to give an idea, for instance, Germany right now has a negative interest rate. The US as well. It's officially zero, but actually the bonds from the US government is paying less than zero. So imagine you put $100 in a savings account that is based on bonds, not a savings account, but a fund that is based on the US bonds or the Japanese bonds or the German bonds. And in the end of 3 months, you're going to get not $100 back, you're going to get $95 back. So that's the situation in the world, because there is an excess of liquidity, which means a lot of money in the world, a lot of capital, without a place to actually invest this capital with a good return that is satisfactory for them. So a country like Brazil tries to attract that type of capital by raising the interest rate. That's why the interest rates in Brazil have been so high for so long. But the investment must go to the profitable areas that can give the return in mid to long term. Although we understand that financial capital does not think in mid and long term, usually thinks in short term. But the situation has changed. Now there are a few things, for instance, Larry Summers, ex-Secretary of Treasury of the US, coined this expression called secular stagnation. The world is immersed in a secular stagnation for the past 15, 16 years. And the financial crisis just came to confirm that. And I'm talking about the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Right now, we have a global crisis where lots of jobs have been lost. Actually, according to the International Labour Organization, 540 million jobs have been lost so far because of the pandemic. So that's more than half a billion jobs that have been lost in 1 year. Production level is extremely low. The demand is extremely low because people do not have money in their pocket to be able to buy things, to consume. But if you look at the stock market's booming. So there is an asymmetry in that needs to be brought together. And if the financial markets don't realize that, what might happen is that the problem is just going to be multiplied in a way that we had never seen before. The effects of unemployment because of this current crisis is already bigger than the 1930s. Bigger because it has been faster. And people keep on thinking about building back better or the recovery process. People are taking too much caffeine, I believe, because they're eager for the recovery to start without even taking care of the emergency that is continuing everywhere. And in Brazil, for instance, now there is a debate about lockdown or no lockdown. Come on, the People are dying. There's no more even sedatives to put people in the ICU beds. There are no more ICU beds. People are dying in a line waiting for ICU beds. So that's a very complicated situation. But to give you an example as far as data, when you talked about, so for instance, in Brazil, in 2015, there were about 9.7 billion reais, which is not that much, invested in science and technology and research, okay? And then in 2016, because of the current crisis at that moment, it dropped to 5.9. In 2019, now it was 4.5. And we're collecting the data for 2020, and most likely this probably was slashed by half because I know of the news of last year when the budget for CAPES is the main financier for research and academic research in Brazil, CAPES and CNPq. So, and they are federal agencies. And the budget for CAPES was slashed by 75% last year. So most likely in 2020, it dropped from 4.5 to, I'm not going to give a number because I don't know, but it dropped a lot. In a country where you don't have science, technology, and innovation, and you don't have research, you don't have human capital. If you don't have human capital, you just become a manufacturing plant for the developed countries. Like, for instance, the East Asian countries did, right? The Southeast Asian countries did, or China did for a while. But they had a plan in the Southeast Asian countries, and that plan actually panned out. So China now is not anymore the manufacturing plant of the world. China is a power to be reckoned with, both militarily and financially. So the point about Brazil is that Brazil is such a big country with so many bright people, with so much, creativity, because that's one thing that Brazilians have a lot, is creativity. As we say, we squeeze milk out of a rock and we can tie a knot in a drop of water. That's a Brazilian say.
Yeah, the jeitinho, the Brazilian jeitinho.
Exactly. But without investment, that jeitinho just becomes an anecdote. You know what I mean? And then for the investors, they look at that and then they look at other countries where they're investing more, both on the bricks and mortar infrastructure and in the human capital infrastructure. They decide to go for those countries.
Yeah. Now, reading the document and seeing how you've outlined those 17 Sustainable Development Goals and understanding the agenda that all these countries should be working towards for 2030. And corporates at the moment are talking a lot about ESGs, environmental, social, and governance goals. And what I feel as though ESGs will really only come to life and make a tangible difference. Because, we talked a lot about corporate social responsibility, back in 2005 when I started TIE, actually, there was a lot of talk about corporate responsibility and, purpose and sustainability. But now it's about ESGs. And I'm just really hoping this is not sort of the flavor of the month, that this is just a lot of talk. I feel now that we're facing this global crisis post-COVID, there is a real opportunity for companies to make a real tangible difference if they link what they're working towards from an environmental or a social point of view with a challenge in another country or their country or whatever it might be. But we're talking a lot in the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot of talk around diversity, inclusion, human rights, the environment. And that's what the ESGs are talking about as well. And I just would love to know, what are your thoughts on this?
I have two words for ESG, because ESG is extremely important. And I'm very glad that it's being discussed in the biggest corporations of the world. We know that the big corporations of the world, they have so much wealth. And not only, I'm not talking about financial wealth, but also intellectual wealth. And that needs to be explored in a very good way. Because if the globe, the planet collapses, it doesn't matter if you have money or if you don't have money, like what's happening in São Paulo, The elite of São Paulo, now it doesn't matter that they have money. They're still in line to get an ICU bed.
Or don't have oxygen.
Or don't have oxygen, exactly. So ESG is all about responsibility and accountability. okay? So we have to face the music, and the companies need to face the music. The climate emergency is a fact, and that fact is affecting everybody, every country, every company, and pretty much the whole economy of the world. And that needs to be mitigated, and that needs to be dealt with. So the environmental pillar of ESG is extremely important. A corporation with large financial muscle cannot keep on investing on a certain production chain that is employing kids. Child labor cannot be accepted for any type of corporation. I remember that 3 or 4 years ago, there was a major scandal involving Zara, which is a major corporation coming out of Spain. The same type of scandal also before involved Nike and involved Gap. We're talking here about big brands, right? So they had to fix that part. No more child labor making sneakers for Nike. Okay, but how about sweatshops? How about the labor conditions in some of the countries that do have that aspect of becoming and being the manufacturing plants of the world, like Bangladesh or Indonesia or Malaysia or Laos, for instance? So extremely important on the S part of the ESG. So environment, S, social. Extremely important that the employees that are making the products and providing the services are healthy, are educated, and are happy, because you're going to get a better product in the end anyway. And the governance is all about accountability on the processes themselves that the companies develop. So it's very hard to admit the fact that if you have a man and a woman performing the same job, a man would still get a higher wage than the woman. It's extremely sad that we still have to deal with such a situation now in 2021. It's extremely sad to deal in a situation in a company where you have the same type of job being performed by a white male and then performed by a black male and performed by a Latino male, and the white male is going to get a higher pay than the others. So that's what the governance aspect of ESG is about. So I go back, it's about responsibility. It's about really being serious about what you say and about what the companies put in their marketing brochures, in their very expensive, ads on TV, on newspapers, on magazines, and accountability. As people say in the UK and the US, companies, corporations need to put the money where their mouth is.
And actually that brings me to Ty, and actually something that I just wanted to ask you about, because, obviously we've known each other for a long time. We started conversations again about your work recently, but you've worked with Ty before. This is what Ty does. We bring this world of Brazil and Malawi and Vietnam and Myanmar and, the number of countries in Africa together with the corporate world. And I believe it's so important so that we can together start finding these solutions. And I just wonder, why in your view is this important? Extremely important. And you said the correct word, bubble. So you get out of the bubble and actually you get the picture of real life. So for instance, just to go back a little bit about the child labor and slavery, in Texas is the second biggest state of the United States, extremely rich state. It's an oil state, but there is slavery in Texas. And we're not talking about Latino migrant slavery. We're talking about white Americans working as slaves in Texas. There's an Oxfam report about that. I participated in a meeting 3 or 4 years ago, and that report was presented. So there is child labor in the UK as well. It's just that nobody knows. You cannot localize. And laws are not enough. In Brazil, for instance, the rule of law on child labor is excellent. But the practice is something else. And there are many kinds of child labor and slavery in a country like Brazil,
in the richest city of the country, in São Paulo. So in São Paulo, you have child labor and you have slavery that is part of the supply chain of the textile industry. Because I don't know if people know, but the textile industry, not only in Brazil, because some of that also is exported, its supply chain depends on small shops. And small shops are usually family-owned shops. And the family employs everybody in the family. The father, the wife, the kids. And they're all working to make T-shirts for a big brand. So the big brand needs to be aware of that and needs to cut that part of the supply chain or to put pressure for the supply chain to get changed. The solution that TIE brings is exactly the fact that it gives a real picture of how things are actually done in the world and the interaction between people, between institutions, between government people and companies that want to invest in their countries, between licit and illicit dealings for that to happen. So all of this needs to be taken in consideration. It's not like a law was written and the law is great and it was enforced for a few months or a few years and now everything is rosy. No, it's not like that, because the forces against that is extremely powerful and extremely insistent. Powerful not because they are of big power thing, but it's powerful because it's part of the human condition and how society evolved or not evolved in those settings and in those territories. We don't have a complete control over those things unless that gets practiced through strict regulations. Okay, so we're talking about good, accountable governments, and we talk about compliance. Because that's a big word that actually I think misses on the ESG. It should be ESGC. Because compliance is extremely important as well, to make sure that everything that you're doing, and if you're doing everything correctly, it still complies to what is supposed to be a sustainable development pathway. And that's what the SDGs talk about. That's what the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development talk about. Things are not separated. They're not isolated. It needs to be incorporated as a whole. It's like that old say that says the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. And that's extremely important. And to put a kind of a concluding or a synthetic way is that especially for corporations, for the financial sector, these actors need to think very seriously about circular economy, because things just don't disappear. It's like the plastic, it does not disappear from the ocean. The packaging, it does not disappear from the landfills. Something needs to be done with that, and somebody needs to be responsible for it. So this kind of responsibility of the individuals to be incorporated needs a very good regulatory process and a very good, responsible, accountable process. Regulatory coming from governments, responsible, accountable process coming from the private sector. And they need to marry to become something that is really, a game changer for the economy and for the planet. Because if that doesn't happen, if, for instance, a furniture company still buys wood from the rainforest in Brazil, the rainforest in Brazil is going to be burnt until the end. And if a company is buying soy from Mato Grosso, from the biggest soy producer in the world, Senhor Blairo Maggi, who used to even be the Minister of Agriculture during the impeachment government of Michel Temer, that soy in the supply chain is also responsible for the burning of the forest. So companies and financiers and investors need to be aware of all of that.
Now, I'm aware of your time, and I'm aware that we're coming to the end of this podcast. So in the last kind of couple minutes that we have, what haven't I asked you that you'd like to tell our listeners, Claudio?
You have not asked what determines all of these problems. What are the financial and trade determinants of the burning of the forest, of the pollution of the rivers, of the pollution of the oceans? That's what you have not asked. And the answer for that is, going back to ESG, which I would add ESGC plus compliance, is responsibility and accountability in every action. In every pound, in every dollar that somebody invests, they should know where that money is going. If you're just in the financial markets, you can have a notion of where that money is going. You know if you're investing on British American Tobacco, the biggest corporation that produces cigarettes in the world, or if you're investing on the Body Shop, that produces non-animal testing cosmetics. You know what I mean? So there's a big difference, for instance, between Body Shop and another company that produces cosmetics with animal testing, using lots of chemicals and things like that. So corporate responsibility also depends on corporate information and knowledge. And investors need to know where that money, where that capital is going, and then start deciding not to put the capital in certain areas and in certain sectors. Even though, and here's the point, even though you have a short-term return that is satisfactory, your mid to long-term return, it's going to be damaging. So people need to be aware of that. It's not only a question of governments regulating everything. That's not what I'm advocating at all. What I'm advocating is actually a complete overhaul of the responsibility and accountability process for both governments, private sector, and the private citizens as well. But private citizens only change when there's something changing with them. It's very rare when individuals just decide to change. Yeah, I'm going to start practicing yoga every morning, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to, it's not that easy. But if something happens to them, then they start changing. And the same thing for the financial markets, because the financial markets are the financial determinants of a lot of these problems. But they are also, the financial markets is also a big part of the solution. They just need to be aware.
I agree. Oh, Claudio, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you. I really appreciate your time and your information, and I'm looking forward to continuing these conversations as things evolve here in Brazil and among our conversations around ESGs, etc. So thank you. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Hey everyone, this is Philippa again. So this is your chance to get involved with TIE. We have 3 absolutely amazing virtual opportunities available, all rooted in connecting the private sector with the social sector to make change. TIE has never been more necessary than right now. So if you're looking for life-changing leadership development opportunities for your employees and you want your company to impact the world, we've got you covered. If you're looking to step out of your comfort zone and use your skills to make a difference and keen to meet other like-minded professionals with similar values, then our TIE Accelerator program is for you. There are so many options, so I urge you to get in touch. Go to theinternationalexchange.co.uk for more information or just shoot us an email. Better companies, better leaders, better world.